afternoon. I'm just going to analyse a game from 2000. A bit late out this afternoon. I was on night shift yesterday, and I'm continuing with my look at the YouTubers who have been influential to me. And this is a game by Kingscrusher, or Tryfon Gavriel, as his FIDE card says. He's a Greek Cypriot from London, a Londoner with Greek Cypriot heritage. He's a very enthusiastic chess player, a very enthusiastic. He's passionate about chess. When you hear him talk about it on his videos, it's very clear that he's passionate as chess, and that passion really comes through. And I think, one of the reasons why David Attenborough is so popular in Britain and the rest of the world is because he's very passionate, he's very engaged about his subject, and that engagement makes him engaging. And he's an IT professional. I think he's an IT freelancer, and as I said, he's from London, Greek Cypriot background, and he played a good deal of tournament play in his younger days, young masters at the Lloyd's Bank and other such things. But nowadays, he's gotten the candidate master title, and these days he usually confines himself to playing blitz or bullet only chess with his own Twitch stream, which is extremely funny. He doesn't make as many videos as he used to on YouTube, which it's sad, but the man's got to do what the man enjoys. That's the important thing. You've got to enjoy what you're doing, otherwise you can't keep doing it day after day. So understandable. He does a lot of courses on Udemy. I think he's got some of the best selling chess courses on Udemy. And yeah, the courses are very interesting, very useful. I've recommended them to many students. I've used them with students. I've learned things from them myself. And yeah, just a wonderfully enthusiastic character. And on the chessgames.com for this game, which is played against Sophie Tidman in 2000, there's one kibitz, and that's from Kingscrusher himself, who says, when I played this game, I was thinking of one immortal game, MacDonald Labourdonnais, 1834. And chess players all over the world smile when you say MacDonald Labourdonnais, 1834. A beautiful, beautiful game with a wonderful finish. I mentioned it the other day that Labourdonnais ends up with 3 pawns on the second, as black ends up with 3 pawns on the second rank. One of them is bounce a queen. And I mentioned how in that Philidor game, Philidor ended up with 1. And I think we looked at the Bronstein game where Bronstein ended up with 2. Well, let's see how many pawns on the second rank Kingscrusher gets here. So, e4, e6, French defence. The idea with the French defence is you're going to let your opponent take the centre, put 2 pawns in the middle, and you're going to start attacking that centre immediately and not stop until that centre is broken down. And that's what he does. He attacks the centre. Black advances. Now, the 2 ways to attack the centre quickly now are to play the pawn to c5, play the pawn to f6. Those are the 2 quickest and most direct ways of attacking the centre, but you can attack it in a less direct fashion, which Kingscrusher does with knight to c6. It is, after all, development. But then he plays f6 straight away. Never play f6, says Ben Feingold. And you can say this is weakening Black's kingside. There's no doubt about that. But got to see what the result will be. It's a book move as far as I know. So in this French advanced variation, so the pawn gets taken, and once the pawn gets taken, that's the pawn structure is now decided, and Black has one, 2, 3, 4 queenside pawns against 1, 2, 3, whilst White has 4 against 3 on the king side. 3. So, yeah. Obviously, black will be trying to force through a pawn on the queen side, and white will be trying to force through a pawn on the king side, and we'll have to see what the result is. So bishop comes to c5, and the bishop comes to d3 so that white is ready to castle. Now you might think that playing knight to f7 makes more sense, but if you play knight to f7, the bishop just comes and pins the knight to the queen. You can never chase it away because of the openness of this diagonal. So he does right in coming there with the queen. So he castles, and now Kingscrusher plays knight to h6. He doesn't mind if his thinking is surely that if white takes the knight, he's going to take back with the pawn, and he's going to have this open file against his opponent's king. I agree with him really. So black plays b4 and attacks the bishop, and it's almost like both sides are making an attack where they've got less pawns, not where they've got more pawns. We'll see how that works out. Yeah, the knight has to come to d8, otherwise it's never going to find its way back into the game. Now he could play queen to c7 to try and preserve the knight, preserve his castling rights by taking with the knight, but he's not that bothered about that. So he allows his opponent to take the knight and put an end to his castling plans. He can't let the pawn be taken and take with this pawn, otherwise this pawn becomes too strong if this pawn moves, so it has to stay there. So he has to play c6, which also gives another square to his bishop or his king, both of which can use the c7 square. So knight comes and attacks the pawn, and the bishop develops to defend the pawn, and the queen develops. And yeah, queen to f4. I'm not entirely sure, but yeah, he's just making himself a little bit nearer to his opponent's king, so can't really complain about that. Yeah, he threatens to take the bishop. Okay, not much that you can do about that. So Kingscrusher goes to attack with his pawn on the king side, and the bishop is taken, and the knight is taken back. And now white threatens to play pawn takes pawn, and when the pawn takes, this pawn falls with a check, which is very nasty. So the king steps forward to do some defensive duties. An exchange is played, and now the pawn on b6 is attacked by the queen and the rook. Has to be defended, and so he defends with the h rook so that the a rook is still active. It's still placed on a good half open file, and it's in an active position, and we'll see it gets to be active. So now we can't any longer keep the blockade of the e pawn, which is just 3 squares away from queening. Is it going to be a new queen? We'll have to see. So now he really is threatening to play e6 and squash that bishop. So instead, he could have played bishop to e6 and stopped that, but then the knight is probably going to come here, and the bishop is probably going to come here, and it's not going to last on that square for very long. So he plays to f5, and his opponent attacks it, the bishop again. Black thinks, okay, I'm just going to put my rook on a nice active square. It is a nice active square, and it gets swapped off, and the knight gets swapped off. And now, yeah, we've got 3 pawns against 1 on the queen side, and 4 pawns against 2 on the king side. So both have 5 pawns, but they're distributed very, very asymmetrically. So pawn's just 2 moves away from queening now. And so black can't play rook to e8 to prevent the pawn from queening, because then the pawn on b6 would have fallen to a devastating check by the queen. So he has to move the pawn first and allow the pawn to advance once more. And the king comes to b6. And the pawn is threatened on c5. And the pawn is taken on a2. So here we have a situation where You know, in the past I've talked about the centre being closed and one side or the other being locked down, and this meaning that you can safely go to attack, but nobody's safe here. They're both attacking, and I think for a good deal of the rest of the game, to me at least, it looks like the player who has the move is attacking most of the time. So it defends the f2 pawn, which was otherwise threatened by the queen, with a check. Yeah, and the king has to come this time to b7, because if he comes to c7, then the king can defend the pawn, but the rook can no longer come to defend the pawn. Here, the king can defend the pawn, and the rook can defend the pawn on c6. Or the rook can also defend the pawn by coming to a6, the other rook. So he attacks it, so he defends it. Yeah. Oh, this is a fairly not much to say on this. He could pick up a pawn here. White, but probably not going to be worth his while. So he threatens the rook, and now he's also threatening at the same time to play pawn to e7 and then e8, get a new queen. Check, threat you have to respond to. And now he plays queen to f2, threatening mate on g2. So that the rook no longer is in a position to defend the pawn if it goes to g1 to defend the mate. So white goes for a more permanent solution and swaps off the queens. But this gives black the time to blockade the pawn again with his rook. The rook comes forward and the king comes to c7, saying, if you want to take that pawn, great, I'm going to take that pawn. And if you want to threaten that pawn, I'm going to come back and defend that pawn. So, fine. And white is threatening to steamroller forward with his pawns. The king comes to e6, great. Attacks the pawn for a second time and attacks the rook. Makes the defence of the situation very difficult. He has to double with the pawns, and now the other rook comes to the aid in the defensive situation. The king comes forward and the rook comes to f8, so if the pawn comes to f4, f5 and then f6, it can be taken on f6 by the bishop. So black makes a break for it with his pawns, and now it becomes a race between the pawns. I think this is great because it allows his king to use this square without getting in the way of the pawns, and the king might be able to come to this square, and who knows. So great, he attacks the rook and defends the pawn at the same time. And now the king relays threatens to come to b4 and c3 and pick up a spare rook. The rook comes in, but the rook defends the pawn on b3 so they can push to c3. Defends pawn on d3 so they can push to c3. King comes, and the rook backs off, and now he attacks the rook on c3 and he takes it. But no, white is going to win the rook on e8, for that pawn. So Kingscrusher decides he'll do it on his terms, and he takes with check, has to be recaptured, and he plays c2, threatening rook to c1, rook to d1, and then getting a queen. f6, and then b2, and he's going to get a new queen. Next move, whatever. And if white pushes the pawn, then black queens. If he pushes the pawn again, black takes the pawn here and then comes here with check and picks up the queen and then cleans up the other pawns, and that's all she wrote. So white resigned at that point. So yeah, he was right. It does have a flavour of that wonderful game between MacDonald and La Bourdonnais from 1834. yeah, don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, and like my videos. Thanks. Bye.